MLA Jinny Sims, very energetic and tireless community advocate and political representative for Surrey Panorama. Thank you very much for joining us. And please tell us, Jinny, your kind of background and your mandate as an elected official here in BC serving the community of Surrey.
Thank you very much. And it is a pleasure to be talking with you. And so let's start with a little bit of an acknowledgement first. I do want to acknowledge that I am speaking to you today from the unceded territory of the Coast Salish peoples, including the Musqueam, the Kwantlen, and the Katzie, and the Semiahmoo. And we thank them for sharing this land with us. I'm an immigrant, first generation immigrant into Canada. I was born in India in Punjab in the district of Jalandhar. And when I was 9 years old, we moved to England. And I did my schooling in England. I went through university there and became a teacher. And then, of course, we had a really right-wing government elected under Margaret Thatcher. And they were really after public services and public education. And we thought we should look overseas for a year or two till they're gone. And that's how come we applied to both Canada and New Zealand and a few other places. And we chose Canada and we thought, okay, we'll come here for a year or two. We did come as landed immigrants because we had teaching jobs, because we applied while we were in England. And we came to Quebec, both my husband and myself. And we said 1 year, then we said, okay, maybe one more year. And then we decided to make this our home. And that was 1975. 77, we came to BC, and beautiful BC, and decided this is where I wanted to raise my children. I had a daughter at the time. She was born in Quebec. And then my son was born here. My 3 grandchildren are born here, and my great-granddaughter as well. So in many ways, I chose Canada to make my home. And when we came here, I saw the lack of the social system that existed in England. But I also saw far more opportunities for ourselves and for our children. And we fell in love with the landscape and the countryside. And the people here have been just absolutely amazing. I have no regrets about becoming a Canadian, and I'm a very proud Canadian, but I'm a very proud Canadian with deep roots both in England and in India. They're just as much part of me as anything else. And I really believe that Canada has been good to us. I became a teacher in England, but I practiced my profession in Quebec and then here in Nanaimo. And became president of the BC Teachers Federation and the vice president for the Canadian teachers at one stage, and also with the BC Federation of Labour. I've had an amazing journey, both as a teacher, then as an activist. And in 2011, I ran to be a member of parliament with one of my heroes, and that's Jack Layton. I was elected, I held amazing portfolios. And one of my favorite portfolios was immigration, multiculturalism, and citizenship. And it was in that portfolio that we were able to filibuster the citizenship bill that Stephen Harper was trying to bring in at that time. And it was an amazing, amazing journey. I got to do great things. And after that, in 2015, I went back to the BCTF to work as a director of professional development and teacher education and social programs, specifically the social justice part. And then in 2017, I ran to be an MLA for Surrey Panorama, and I just got re-elected. And I want to thank my diverse community. And as you know, Muslims are a very large part of my community, and I've always been impressed with the support I've received from the full diversity of our community. And right from the beginning, when I got elected as an MP, we created, through my office, very close links with our Muslim community, because as you know, in 2011, after 9/11, everybody was still, the tensions were still there. And there was a lot of fear still, a lot of fear about speaking out. but also there was, and still is, a lot of racism. And through my MP office and through Param Grewal, who worked with me at the time, we worked very closely with the local masjids and with the community organizations to address many of the challenges facing our Muslim community.
Well, I have to say, very admirable and impressive accomplishments. And to come new to Canada and to serve in these high political roles that you've been able to achieve, it's very impressive for anyone. So I really hats off to you. And I do see you at community events and a lot of energy, and you put a lot of us younger folks to shame with your work ethic and your energy. So thank you again for all your great work. Now,
Tarek, that's the amazing thing. Canada is a land of opportunities. Are there challenges here for Canada for people like us who come from other countries? Absolutely, there are challenges. But I believe there are always pathways and ways for us to advocate to make Canadian society more inclusive and better so that it serves everybody, no matter where they've come from, what their religion, and what their cultural heritage. Because at the end of the day, what you and I want, and everybody here want, is a safe and inclusive society for everybody.
Agreed. And although we share similar heritage from Punjab, actually our family hails from Halwara, not too far from Jalandhar, before partition. And so we share an ethnic kind of origin, but obviously in the 1970s and 80s, 90s, before the Islamophobia became very mainstream, people of color were discriminated against, again, because of our color and because of our background and historical origin. And I know things have improved quite a bit since the 1970s and 80s and 90s. There was a lot more open racism at that time, physical attacks, verbal attacks on our communities. A lot of that, at least from a color perspective, I think, there's been some improvements. Now, with this whole racialized environment, and especially with the rise of, or the increased rise of white supremacy and white nationalism, and a consistent focus is anti-immigration, anti-people of color, anti-Muslim as an example. So if you could just let me know in terms of the work, I know the Premier John Horgan and the team for the province of British Columbia is working hard to kind of address systemic racism to all people of color. Maybe we could talk about the strategy of maybe where we are, how we've improved, and where we need to kind of improve.
Thank you very much for that question, Tarek. And I'm always reminded of 1962. That's the year that my family moved to England. And I was the only one when I got to the high school. In the elementary school, there were a few more kids of color different than the mainstream Caucasian. But at the high school, I was the only one. And I can remember not having the language and feeling that isolation that you do feel. But today, what we have is very, very different. I think in many ways, because we as a country and worldwide felt we tackled racism in the 70s and 80s, that we did it. It was like a check mark, done. But what happened is during that time, we all learned to use the right kind of language. What I called up was we cleaned up our language and had the facade of the fact that we had addressed racism. And I think in many ways, racism went deeper. And what we failed to do was to take off those layers that we had built in order to look at some of the root causes of racism, which is something that we really do have to tackle. I believe education is an absolute key component, and I've said that from the beginning of time. But we also have to start talking about some of the terms we use here in Canada. Sometimes when people talk about racism, they said, oh, we have no racism. We're a multicultural country. You know, being a multicultural country does not make you free of racism. And being a multicultural country, what does that mean? Does that mean because I've eaten a samosa, I've eaten butter chicken, and I've seen the inside of a masjid or the gurdwara, that means racism has ended? Does it mean because at Vaisakhi time or at the others, I get dressed up in a Punjabi suit or I wear some other ethnic clothing, that racism has ended and that's true multiculturalism? I think for me, we have to start with some of the terminology we use, and multiculturalism has to mean far more than what it looks like and tokenism. It has to mean where we not only understand what it means, but we celebrate our diversity. One of the things is we often hear Canada is a very tolerant country. I am a Canadian. My children are born here, they're Canadian. My grandchildren are Canadian. My great-granddaughter is Canadian. And so many thousands of kids I've taught are Canadian. And because your color is different or you speak with an accent, you don't want to be tolerated. I think inclusivity has to mean accepted and celebrated. And I think we have, in many ways, I don't like the word tolerated anymore, because to me, it means we will put up with you. I don't want people to put up with me or with my children or with my constituents. I want them to be with them, to accept them as part of the Canadian mosaic of our tapestry. So that's one thing. And the other thing is our institutions. Whether it's the federal government, provincial government, municipal government, or whether it's the private sector, there are glass ceilings that we do have to shatter. Just because we get a few people appointed as judges, lawyers, and move into every sphere of life, and we get a few elected politicians, does not mean that we've reached inclusivity if the politicians we've elected are not going there to be the voice to build a more inclusive and just Canada for everybody. And so as politicians, we also have a role to play to look at policy and to engage our communities in policy and change policies that create systemic barriers. So our public service, our elected service, our judicial service, our enforcement service, they all have to reflect the diversity of our population. And I don't just mean people of South Asian descent, I mean our total population, right across the board. It's only when we have that that we can say we have an inclusive country. Until then, as long as the kids are facing barriers and people of different origin are facing barriers, then I think we still have a long way to go. I'm very proud of the work our government has done. And I would say that we've taken steps, but we still have a long way to go. And I think I'm very proud of the work. I am proud of the work John Hogan has done and the kind of direction that's been given out into the public service as well as into the political sector, to make sure that our offices and the Premier's office and right across the board begin to reflect the diversity that we are, so that our voices are heard. At the same time, it starts at home, and it's very important in the education sector. And I always say that we ourselves have to also be careful of the language we use, and that when we are talking to our children, we are passing on the values of humanity, the values of equity, the values of equality, the values of social justice. Yes, keep our language. Yes, absolutely. Religion is a very personal thing and we're guaranteed freedom of religion. We should keep connected with our roots, but within our roots, what do we work on out in the mainstream community? We are mainstream as well. How do we work so that we find common areas to draw on and we don't always focus on the differences? A lot of racism starts at home. I can tell you, I've experienced it from both sides myself. I went to school, I went to university, kind of a little bit oblivious to a lot of it. But then I married a Caucasian back in 71 when it wasn't quite the done thing yet, right? And the racism I experienced from both cultures was very, very hurtful. And so I think for me, we've got to address systemic racism, we've got to open doors, and we've got to provide additional support. And if Black Lives Matter has taught us anything, it is that lives matter. Brown lives matter, Muslim lives matter, Sikh lives matter, Hindu lives matter, Christian lives matter, Jewish lives matter. But we have a lot of work to do to address the deficiencies and the inequities that exist for our diverse communities of color or of different faith. So that is a big, big challenge. And I'm very proud of the work we've started. We have a parliamentary secretary, as you all know. Ravi Kahlon was the parliamentary secretary for taking on multiculturalism, which includes racism. Anne Kang held that role as well. And Rachana Singh holds that role right now. But this kind of work, as the Premier says, is not done by individuals. They help us to focus. It has to become an integral part of every elected person, every person working in the bureaucracy, and everybody out in our community, all our organizations as well. And I know that the Muslim community has some amazing advocacy groups. It becomes all our part to, yes, be very protective of cultural heritage and language and religion, but at the same time, not to build silos. Because the most important thing I learned in life from a little girl from my dad, that you get much further in life if you help to build bridges than if you help to build tunnels. And by the tunnels, he meant those that just go down, 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 down. You just sink further and further in, deep holes. So for me, I'm always looking for ways in the community, both within my elected role and with me as a citizen of Surrey. How do I help to build those bridges? How do we help to open the eyes through education? And this is where our teachers play an amazing part. And I would not be right for me if I didn't do a huge shout out to the teachers for the anti-racism work they have done since way back when, but I've been very familiar with it from 1978 on, including rewriting and pushing for parts of the curriculum to be rewritten at one stage so we could get some of the history that was missing. Is it all done yet? No, we still have a long, long way to go.
And you're right. And you held a very important post as the president of the PC Teachers Federation. And if anything systemic, it's education. And I think where a lot of people as kids going into the public school system, this is where racial identities and racial discriminations happens. At least I can say from my experience, that's where people couldn't pronounce my name. I did understand a certain bias against, again, my ethnic origin as well as religion early on from the school process. And even in the modern day of 2021 or 2020, I've heard anecdotal stories of Muslim students, Muslim women that wear hijab or with obvious sounding Muslim names for the boys, and being called a terrorist, or do you have a bomb there, or Osama bin Laden or Al Qaeda or something like that. And so again, extremists or extremism like the Ku Klux Klan doesn't speak for all Christians around the world. Adolf Hitler was of the Christian faith, doesn't speak for the vast majority of Christians around the world. And similarly, extremist groups are the tiny percentage that does not reflect 1.8 billion. However, there's a certain, at least as far as I can see, a prevalent perception that Muslims are somehow, have this type of image. And as a result, people feel emboldened to make such derogatory and hurtful statements, especially in the formative years as a teenager, as an elementary school student, or even a university student, by hearing such terms from students, but even from educators and teachers, really biased ways of being defamatory and derogatory towards Muslims, I know a lot has to change. But in this context of specific Islamophobia, and I know we've been reaching out ourselves to various school boards, the Vancouver School Board, Annie Ohana, who's at the LA Matheson High School. She's trying to help us introduce some Islamophobia curriculum, just so people know that this is, again, a faith that's 1,400 years old. It's part of the, a lot of tradition and history, but as you know, it takes an effort and a struggle. So please, let's talk about Islamophobia specifically and in the school setting, because that really is informing the wider kind of racism that's out there.
No, thank you for bringing that up. And 9/11, as you know, was a big turning point. And for many, many years, when after 9/11 happened, for a lot of the Muslim community, and it's not blaming, it's the reality, everybody went into a cocoon. And during that time, the kind of outrage and verbal abuse that was happening out there against Muslims just amplified. And there wasn't too strong a defense out there at that time, because after 9/11, even in the Muslim community, I would say a lot of people just went like this, and just to protect themselves, because it just felt really, really unsafe. And it was unsafe times to talk. And my first experience, and I know how this is because growing up in England, I can remember the first time I went to Bradford and somebody yelling Paki at me. I'd never heard of it. And it was my first experience. And I was thinking, why are they doing that? But also, what most of my teaching was done in Nanaimo. So when I visited a school when I was an MP, I was actually both surprised and then not surprised by the kind of silos I saw in the schools I visited, where kids were in large part, I would say 99%, hanging out along ethnic, religious lines in our schools right here in Surrey. And I came home, I was so upset. I even remember phoning the principal the next day, and I said, as I walked into your school and I went down different hallways, it was like visiting the United Nations, but everybody was in their own pod. And I was surprised at that, but then I wasn't surprised, because if you're not feeling safe, you're not feeling accepted, you're not feeling included, then you're going to go to people who are like you to hang out with them. Yeah. So in the school system, still has a lot to do. I always say, despite all the amazing work the BCTF does, and they have a whole division devoted to this, to their social justice work, they run workshops every year in the summer and during the year as well. And on professional development days, they give workshops on anti-racism and how to address issues of Islamophobia. I know that specifically. But just as everybody else is human, so are teachers. Even within the profession, every profession, you're going to find those inherent kind of prejudices coming out. But I think when we hear them, we have to call them out and we have to put remediation in place. Because there is no place, and I say it because I believe this, there is no place in our public schools, I will say anywhere, but absolutely in our public schools, for any kind of racism or any kind of bullying or anything that makes any child feel unsafe. A child belongs to all of us, to a community. It takes a village to raise a child. I'm a believer in that. And I think that the Muslim community and you and others have done an amazing job with some of the workshops you put on. The opening the masjids up so people could come in and say, look, it's no different than walking into a church or a gurdwara. It's a place of worship. And there are not nefarious things going on in here. And I think all of that is great. But I can remember the first year that the masjid doors were opened, and I went door to door with the leaders from the local masjid to hand out the flyers to people, especially who were non-Muslims. And mainly they took me into the area that had a lot of non-South Asians, because they didn't feel safe and welcome even going out to give out the leaflets at that time. And as we gave out the leaflets and they began to talk to people, I would start off the conversation, then I would introduce them. I watched eyes open on both sides. Both sides began to listen and hear each other in different ways. So I agree with you about the curriculum. I think our curriculum needs to have a lot more of our multicultural history, especially in the social studies part. But it also needs to address social justice issues. There are many isms that we need to address. There's racism, Islamophobia falls under that. There's gender-based issues as well. There's poverty. There are so many that we have to address, but every one of them is important. So I'm a great believer that part of the core curriculum, if I had my way and I could dictate that, it would be that there would be a whole, not a course, but every subject that is taught would have included in it our diversity and how do we address these critical kind of issues, as well as a civic course where students would learn a lot about each other and about Islamophobia, why it's wrong. Our kids know, when you talk to our kids, they are amazing. They're so accepting of each other. It's only as they learn from others and sometimes from the adults that they go off at a tangent. So I'm a great believer in education. I think the community has done a great outreach. The multi-faith community has a role to play. I used to teach comparative religion at a university, just so you know. And one thing I learned, that 99% of what's in religions, our major religions, is all about love, and it's all about accepting each other. And the differences that exist are very, very, they are there between the different religions, but they are not the ones that we want to throw ourselves on the sword over. Every person has the right to practice their religion. And if you have that right, yes, I want to know about Islam. I mean, I took some classes when I was in England, when I went to university, because I wanted to learn more. And I think when we learn more, some of our fears and stereotypes disappear. I think our biggest challenge, and some people are going to get offended by this, is the language we use. I don't mean Punjabi, Urdu, English, or anything like that. I mean, it is the way we talk, with the way we talk our words. Even amongst, I would say, our teenagers, when you hear them relate to each other, they've got so used to using terms and terminology that is so bullying, that is so silencing, that is so hurtful. And I think we have to have those conversations in the larger communities, but we also have to have those conversations at home and in our religious institutions about, yes, if we don't want others to be racist, if we don't want others to come after us because of our religion or the way we look, we also have to play that part. But we also have to teach our kids about ourselves, about our history, about the struggles. Because it's when they understand our own history, individual history, and the struggles, that they will realize there is a path forward. And we have to engage our young people in finding a path forward. It can't be some seniors, and I love our seniors, sitting in a room thinking they've got all the answers for anything. How can we have the answers? Even I as a teacher, how can I have the answers without listening to the youth of today and hearing from them what the problems are? They may be totally different than what I am. They tell me that they feel they live in 3 communities. They feel they live in no man's land. They're neither accepted here totally, nor are they accepted here totally. So they move in this gray area in between, backwards and forwards. And how do we address the mental health issues that creates? And also, when you live in no man's land, you don't have anchors, your roots. You're going to be drawn to behaviors and groups that are not good in our community. So how do we work on our kids' self-esteem so that they're proud of their roots? I think that's a major challenge for all of us.
And I think one critical thing that is becoming part of education informally is social media and social media biases. And if we click on certain videos that reinforce a certain bias against a race or community, and then the social media algorithms will serve up more. And then there are these pseudo academics or pseudo intellectuals that present racism in a quote unquote professional manner, professionally presented racism in a way that seems quote unquote credible. And they say the most inhuman things. A friend of mine said they'll even have pretty women saying hateful things, like they're very well dressed, very attractive, but what they say is so hateful and defamatory. So there's a systematic design to defame certain communities, whether it's immigrants, refugees, Muslims, Black people, Jewish people. Exactly.
Parents have a responsibility, Tariq, to monitor their kids' social media. I'm sorry, I don't call that intrusion. I think when they are very little, there should be filters put on. And even as they're teenagers, you as a parent need to be a little bit more aware of where your kids are going on social media and the kind of stuff that they're doing with. I go to something as simple as even the video games they play. A lot of people get upset at me, and I know my grandson does, because when we keep buying them all these games where it's bang, shoot, you're shooting a Muslim, you're shooting a Sikh, you're shooting a Hindu. Well, that's what are we teaching them? So, like, I used to have a rule, I had no toy guns in my house as my kids were growing up, nor did my grandkids. But I know that they still pretended that they had guns. They just used to make them with their fingers, right? So for me, as parents, we have so many more responsibilities and we have to exercise them. And one of the key things that is very, very important to kids' mental health is having someone in the family where they're not talking at each other, somebody they can relate with, whether it's an uncle, an aunt, a cousin, a grandparent, where they can go and share everything with them. Because, grandparents, I learned so much from my grandparents, I can tell you. She would tell you stories, but you knew she was teaching you something, right? And we can tell our kids so much through stories and things. But I always go back, and I'm not excusing. I think governments have a huge role to play, as do social institutions, both political and non-political. But I think we as individual families do as well. And like my kids are, as I told you, my husband is Caucasian. He's an Englishman. But I wanted to make sure my kids knew where their roots were. I took them back to India for a whole year. And we traveled to every state so that they knew.
Every state in India. Wow. And that's a huge country.
Because Kashmir was shut off at the time. And we were on our way to Kashmir when it got shut off because Mrs. Gandhi got shot and, there were all that violence ensued. And I wanted them to know that their mother comes from a country that has a great history and a great geography. That their roots are not just in England with colonialism, with everything they learned about from there. They were going to have those anyway taught into them through their history classes. But both my husband and I took a year off work without pay, and we traveled throughout India. And that was so that they were rooted in that. And even now, like when I first ran, I remember somebody saying to my son, well, we're going to vote for your mom because she's the only non-brown person running, right? And my son said, well, you don't have to vote for my mom, but you need to know that she is of Indian roots and she's very proud of it. And I'm Indian too. Even though I was born in Canada, that's where my roots are. And that family came to the next debate and came and talked to me. And they said, it's because my son was so honest. Not only they, but everybody in the cul-de-sac that year had an NDP sign where an NDP sign had never been seen before. So it is giving our kids that confidence to be who they are. Like my son feels just as comfortable walking into a masjid as he does into a gurdwara, as he does into a synagogue, as he does into a church. So because it's important for us to teach our children, yes, our religion, my parents' religion was Sikhism. But I wanted them to know about the other religions as well. Because through knowledge comes a form of understanding.
And our heritage from the subcontinent is so rich and so amazing, the history. And I have a cousin that had a degree in Indian history, and he would just tell me all the stories of the various history of the various dynasties and the different regions of the subcontinent. And even though being raised in the West, we tend to hear so much about the greatness of Western civilization, and we barely hear a footnote about the heritage and the thousands of years of history and accomplishments. And it's worth, again, for our identity as who we are, that although we are Canadian, but our heritage from the subcontinent is so rich and so amazing, to be proud of that and to love it. And I think it's worth a constant reminder for ourselves and all of our generations that we come from a rich heritage, and we are part of the Canadian mosaic. We bring that to the table, but to really truly understand our identity and our heritage is very important in the way to combat racism. So once we know who we definitively are and are proud of who we definitively are, racially, religiously, then we can definitely combat racism from a position of strength, not in a position of weakness or defensiveness. That, hey, we're proud of who we are, but we are also contributors to this society for decades. For even some of our families have been here for over 100 years, and as a result, we all take share in the good of our country, and the acknowledgement that we're all in it together. Now, the other kind of aspect you mentioned is with our young generation. Every generation has a new challenge, and you mentioned video games, and I've noticed a lot of socializing is now online through these video games that are played remotely, and the actual people getting together face to face and hanging out with one another face to face as teenagers, as young people, is being replaced by hanging out online. And I think this depersonalization of sitting with a Black person, sitting with a Chinese person, sitting with a Filipino person, sitting with other races and religion, and breaking bread by being kind of separate and having virtual relationships, I think it's dehumanizing other groups more so. So I'm sure that is one area for mental health, that people need to physically meet one another to dispel these myths and stereotypes.
We all live our lives on Zoom these days, or on MS Teams, or somehow. But I am really worried about the impact this is going to have on the mental health of our children, especially because they don't have the same links in schools as they used to, and after school as well. COVID-19 is going to have an impact, but it goes beyond that. I think you have absolutely summed it up. And I loved something you said. You have to know who you are before you can be at a table where you are a full participant. If you are at a table apologetically, that's going to come out, and you're not going to be a full participant. And I know as a teacher that any community, any culture that loses its language eventually loses its culture, loses its history. And once you've lost your history and you've lost your language, you've lost your culture, you really have fallen into the melting pot, and root issues become really, really important. So do self-esteem. I've often used the garden analogy, right? When you have a plant, you plant a tree out in your backyard. If the tree has deep roots and the roots are fed and nurtured, when a big storm comes, that young tree will sway like this. But once the storms are gone, it will be upright again and it will keep growing. But if the roots are not deep and they are shallow, they haven't been nurtured, when that storm comes, the tree's going to fall, the roots are going to be exposed to the elements, and the tree's going to die. That is an analogy for raising our kids. If our kids and we are not connected to our roots, we will lose our cultural heritage, but also of who we are. I left India at the age of 9. I went to a school where nobody spoke Punjabi at the beginning. I went to university where I only bumped into one person who spoke Punjabi. That tells you how long ago it was. And I taught in schools where there were very few South Asians at the beginning. It's only later on in Nanaimo that families started to come. But I had to keep my language alive. And I had to find other ways. My family was in England. And I still read, I write Punjabi. I have to, before I moved to Surrey, I used to make a conscious effort to keep it up. And I would speak to my parents in Punjabi. My vocabulary was limited, but it's improved living in Surrey. And I've widened my reading. I've picked up some professional reading and tried to do it in Punjabi now. So why? Because there are things I can say in Punjabi even today, no matter how brilliant, and I'm an English teacher, I teach literature as well, and I can find all the right words, but some of the feelings I get when I used to talk to my mum in Punjabi, I could never feel those emotions when I spoke in English. Now for me, because I was 9 and English is my second language, but it's like my first language too, there are things I can express in English even today that I can't quite express in Punjabi because of all my academic life has been through the English medium. So absolutely roots. And I think religious institutions have to start, yes, it's very, very important to teach the tenets of the faith, but with that has to be some of the history. But also our kids don't want to hear about doom and gloom. They don't want to hear about all the bad things. They want to hear about the beauty of our culture. They want to hear about the beautiful countryside that exists, whether it's back in Pakistan or India or wherever. I remember taking my kids to the Ajanta caves and showing them what was there, or when we were in Goa, going on the Kerala, going on the backwater trip. And when we came back and showed the pictures, even to my own siblings, they said, "That isn't India." And I said, "Yes, it is." Because for most of us, and I'm sure it's like for many of you, like in your family, you will do when you go back to your village, at different movements, whether it's the farmers' protests, whether we look at what happened to the south of us or what happens in other countries right now, what is it people are protesting? And when I look at the protest and some of the language that's coming out of there, it seems to me, being a history teacher, like have very close connections with the fights that went on leading up to the fight for independence. And from the stories my father used to tell me, now I have cousins who are in that farmers' protest, and but for us, because we live over here, we are just so far removed, and but our children are not that far removed. I hear from so many young people who see those struggles, or who saw the struggles. Well, they saw what happened in Kashmir, and whenever they see what's happening in China with the Muslim community there as well, our kids care. They really do. They want justice. And we just have to find a way of engaging them in a positive social justice movement to build a better world, and not let them, not abandon them.
Well, you brought up something powerful about the genocide in China. And what's happening there is the Jewish community reached out to us as the Muslim community because of our extensive work with them, and they wanted to do something meaningfully to send letters to parliamentarians. And we just heard that the Parliament of the federal government has declared that it's a genocide from Parliament, not officially from the federal government of Canada, but. So that was pushed by the Jewish community in collaboration with our Muslim community and the Christian leaders. So we have a forum coming up on March 21st at 7 p.m. Yes, and that'll be with a rabbi, a priest, and a mufti that will talk from their specific religion and backgrounds. The inhumanity and how we, with love and how we can all work together to address this injustice and this genocide and lobby for change together.
Yeah. One of the things that happens is I love this interfaith work that is going on in Surrey, and it is really amazing, like in the Lower Mainland. And I think I'm a great believer. It's, when somebody attacks you personally, it's easy to defend yourself. You raise your arms. But I think a true sense of a community is when you're willing to work together because else is being attacked and they're part of your group, or even if they're not part of your group. So to me, that's a great humanitarian trait that we all need to develop, that we don't just open our voices when we personally are impacted, but wherever injustice occurs, we open our voices. Now, sometimes your voices are muted or partly muted because of different positions you do hold and jurisdictions and this and that. But on the whole, for social justice issues, we have a lot of work to do. And I have attended some of the interfaith conferences in the past when we could actually be there in person. I'm an in-person. I actually spend so many hours every day on Zoom or MS Teams, and I do it because I have to. And it's one way of engaging. But I cannot wait for the real human face-to-face where you can read each other's eyes, you can read each other's reactions in a more meaningful way. And but I do want to thank you and your whole team for the kind of outreach you do into the other communities. It's not just that they reached out to you. I know that you have also devoted a lot of time and energy reaching out, and that's appreciated. And I'm getting a signal now.
I know you probably have more meetings to go in, but I just wanted to share
I have a cabinet committee meeting coming up.
Okay. Okay. Well, I'll close with this. Our first mosque in British Columbia The people that came to help were our Sikh community that was initially based in Kitsilano in the 50s. And they helped build our first mosque with our community in 1962. So just in closing, we're cooperating, working together for social justice and change as we've done for decades. And thank you again, Jinny, for your time, your effort, and your service to the community. We really appreciate it.
Thank you. And thank you for taking the time for this dialogue. I've enjoyed it. I feel so passionately about this whole subject of building a socially just and inclusive society. I could talk for days and days and I wouldn't have said everything I want to say, but thank you.